Jason, let's start with the basics. Where we stand now, what's happened to income distribution in the last 20 years? I think slide 2 would help here, I believe. Yes.
Yeah. I think slide 2 gives us the reason why we're even having this conversation in the first place. Because if you ask how an economy is performing, really what you want to look at is the income of the typical household, so maybe something like median income. We don't have great median income statistics going back a long period of time and comparable across countries, but what we do have is the average income for the bottom 90%, which coincidentally happens to be pretty similar to the median. And you see a pattern across a range of countries, which is they were rising strongly in the 50s and 60s, and then at some point they flattened out. That flattening out happened earlier in the United States. If you look, Ireland is the last place where that flattening out happened, but pretty much everywhere it did flatten out. And it flattened out for 2 reasons, and the 2 reasons, the relative importance of them varied from country to country. One is productivity growth started slowing. In this country, it started slowing around 1970.
Excuse me, we have a slide of that.
Okay.
I believe.
I think that is number 15.
15 works? Okay.
I mean number 5, sorry, number 5.
Yes.
5. Can't count, which is a bit of a problem.
Sorry to break your flow here, but it's good to see.
Productivity growth, if you look at most of the European countries, have had pretty much 70 years of slowing productivity growth. There was a big burst in productivity in the years after World War II as they were rebuilding their economy, as they were taking advantage of some of the innovations, many of which started in the United States and spread. And then if you look at a moving average, that productivity growth has generally been falling, and this is part of a bigger issue than just this income one. The United States didn't have that rebuilding from World War II, so we never had the big burst quite as much as other countries. We also had a new economy in the 1990s. You see our line actually going back up then, and that's actually helped boost our incomes. But we've had a much more serious increase in inequality. And so if you're trying to understand what happened to our family incomes and that flattening out, that increase in inequality is a really big part, an important part of the story.
Actually, let's put on 6, and I think you can continue with this discussion. 6 is the productivity growth versus the bottom 90%.
Yeah. So this shows just different levels of disconnect in different countries. I mean, in all 3 of these countries, the US, the UK, and France, you have different degrees of disconnect that started at different points in time. And once again, you see that our disconnect between productivity growth and income actually started earlier, and it's a phenomenon that's increasingly spread to other countries.
Take the next step. Why? What explains this graph? What do you think is the inside the hood? What's the mechanism that's doing that?
Mm-hmm. There are, in inequality in general, and I think this is one of the important contributions of Thomas Piketty's book, is you can think of 3 sources of inequality, not all of which are captured by this graph. One is inequality within labor income. So a manager gets paid more than a line worker. The second is inequality within capital income. Somebody collects a lot more in dividends than somebody else. And then the third is the income shares. How much of total national pie is going to labor versus going to capital? And the reason that third one matters is even though labor income is distributed unequally, it's much more or much less unequal than capital income. So anytime you shift away from labor and towards capital, you're also increasing it. So you have these 3 different things: labor, capital, and the labor share. To some degree, all 3 have had different degrees of importance at different times, and we can come back to it, and all 3 have, to some degree, different causes. In terms of labor income inequality, which is the one that's been the most studied and gotten the most focus up until now, there it even depends where you're looking. If you're looking at the ratio of income at the 90th percentile to the 10th percentile, something like the change in unionization over the last century has had a big impact on that. As unions rose, that compressed. As unions declined, that earnings spread rose. Unionization is probably less important if you're thinking about, say, the top 1%. Their globalization, technology, and changes in norms are probably the more important part of the story. If you're looking at the bottom 10 percentile, the erosion in the purchasing power of the minimum wage. So I think it's a complicated story on the labor side. I think there's a lot of different pieces of it depending on which parts of the distribution you're looking at. But I tend not to be a partisan for this is the explanation. I completely disagree with that one.
Can I interrupt you?
Oh, sure.
At one point, you alluded to, there's one piece of this which I think people differ a great deal about, which is the importance of how important is the change in CEO pay relative to other pay in creating this much labor inequality.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at the top 1%, 60% of it is managers. And the top 1%, as we know, the share of income going to them has risen a lot. So that is largely a story of the share of income going to managers. So I think not just necessarily CEOs, but the top paid individuals at a variety of companies is definitely, I think, an important part of the story.
And is that a market phenomenon? Would you say that's a competitive market phenomenon, that we're paying CEOs more because of markets?
I think that's part of it. You look at hedge fund managers, and they do really well. They are in a very competitive market. They're not, there's a lot of hedge funds competing with each other. So to some degree, what's going on there isn't the classic sort of corporate governance has failed and they're just giving money to themselves. They don't, they're just a partnership. They're benefiting from the global scale of their operations. They're managing a lot of money all over the world. That's not to say there aren't a set of issues and challenges associated with it. That's not to defend it. And I think the corporate governance part of the story and the norms is also part of it. And
well, I didn't mean to.
But I don't think it's the only part.
I did mean to sidetrack you, but
yeah.
but I didn't mean to break your flow.
Right.
Are there other sources of inequality that we should keep in mind when we
right.
think about this?
Right. I mean, so part of what sent me down the path of the article you now have in front of you is Piketty had these three. He had the labor, the capital, and the share. He talked a lot about all three, and nowhere in his book did he bother to tell you which was the most important and when it was the most important. In fact, in general, he had a presumption that for the United States, the one that mattered was the labor income, the managers getting paid more than the line workers. And Paul Krugman, writing a very positive review of his book, said his book is really important. It may tell you about the future of America, but it doesn't tell you about what's happened so far, because his book is mostly about capital, and in the United States, inequality has mostly been about labor. What I tried to do is go to the data and break down what fraction of inequality was coming from each of the three sources I said. And it's a little bit complicated because there's different data sources that tell different things, and it's sometimes hard to tell capital income from labor income. But in some of the best data, and a couple different data sources give you similar answers. The answers over the last 40 years, if you look at the top 10%, 84% of the increase in inequality of the top 10% versus the bottom 90 is labor income inequality. So that's exactly the Krugman, Piketty traditional economic story. Now you look at the top 1%, and it's 68% is due to labor income. So it's still the predominant thing, but there's a lot of capital. You look at the top 1/10 of 1% over the last 40 years, and now it's about 50-50. Half of it is labor income, but half of it is capital income. The next thing I'd say along that line is if you just look at the last 20 years, capital has become an increasingly important source of the increase in inequality. And so all of those, who's paid more than who is still important, but it's becoming less and less important, and trying to understand why some people have much more wealth and get a higher return on their wealth is much more important for the last 20 years for the top 1/10 of 1%, and I think for the future as well.
I'm glad you raised Piketty here. Everyone knows we're talking about Thomas Piketty and his doomsday book, you might say. Piketty offers a very simple relationship between the return on capital and the rate of economic growth. And from that deduces that it's highly implausible that the income will not continue to grow ever more unequal. Can you, and I don't think you agree.
Right. I mean, I think it's commendable that someone chose to make an economic forecast going out 200 years in the future. Not all of us would have the courage to do that. But I think, first of all, there's the theory itself, and we won't bore people with the issues, but it is likely that the growth rate will slow in the future relative to the past for the simple reason that our workforce is growing more slowly in the future than it's grown in the past. So even if we have the same productivity growth, slower workforce growth means overall slower economic growth. So wages are tied to the growth rate of the economy, so it'll affect wage growth. The question is what happens to the rate of return to capital. And he thinks that that'll stay high even as the economy slows, and so you'll see this shift to wealth. The two reasons to be less sure about that is, one, how substitutable capital and labor are. As you start accumulating a lot of capital relative to the number of workers, at the margin, the productivity of that capital goes down, and that drives your rate of return down. The second thing is, as people live longer, they save more, and as they save more, that also drives the rate of return down. So I think it's perfectly plausible that the rate of return would go down point for point with the growth rate, maybe even go down more. And just as a little sidebar, there's been Piketty mania this last year. There's also been secular stagnation mania. And the secular stagnation thesis is all about a large decline in the rate of return to capital and the challenges that that poses for our economy. So if you want to pick your dismal theory, you can't simultaneously pick the Piketty dismal theory and the secular stagnation dismal theory. You have to choose.
Yes, but
one
either way, we're stuck, right? Who knows? Okay, let's talk a little bit about what the Obama administration has or hasn't done about inequality. You did an interesting calculation in the article. Can you talk a bit about it?
Sure. There's two, when you think about inequality, there's before tax inequality and after tax inequality. And before tax inequality, it's hard to measure direct causal impact because it's what you're doing to help the middle class, to affect the distribution of wages. Minimum wage is one of the more measurable ones. But what I looked at was after-tax inequality, and in particular, the tax cuts, tax changes we passed in this administration. At the bottom end, we expanded the earned income tax credit, the refundability of the child tax credit, and tax credits for college. It's helping about 25 million people a year by an average, 25 million households, more people, by an average of $1,000 apiece. And then at the upper end, the top tax rates went back to what they were under President Clinton. The capital gains and dividends rates went from 15% to 23.8%, partly because of the expiration of the Bush tax cuts and because of a surcharge we did to help pay for the Affordable Care Act. And so if you look at those changes on the top, on both labor and capital income, and those changes at the bottom, cutting taxes, took a look at what that meant. And what it meant was, to put it incomprehensibly, the Gini index fell by 0.6 index points. 0.6 index points, is that large or small? It's a half a decade of the increase in inequality that we've seen. So I think that's pretty meaningful for a set of actions. And what we're working on quantifying, I think we'll have in a month or two, so I don't know if you do like an errata for your volume, and we could just introduce it in that way, is the Affordable Care Act is even bigger than those tax changes. It's more complicated to do the modeling, and we're trying to get it right. But I think once you take that into account, my guess is the policies have undone more than a decade of the increase in inequality.
Okay, let me get to what in a way is the political economy of this. Arthur Oken, some of you may know his name, was an economist, a very great economist who long gone, but who suggested the notion of the big trade-off, that we have a choice. If we want growth, we have to let markets work. If we're willing to sacrifice some growth, we can redistribute income. That the process of interfering with markets reduces potential growth by introducing an element of inefficiency in the market economy. Now, a lot of economists have stared at this, but Oken is a big name, and usually you just hear this and it goes by, yes, that's the truth, but But you addressed this correctly, and I think in a very interesting way.
Yeah. So I first took a look at this in a paper that I did with Joe Stiglitz for the Fed's Jackson Hole conference in 1998. And there we did a couple things, but one of the things we did was we looked at the cross-country evidence of, do you have more or less inequality, do you have more or less growth? And we took the standard econometric models that people used for growth, and we added inequality as a variable. And we got a big blur. You couldn't tell if inequality was positive or negative, but you could pretty much rule out that it was a large negative. Last year, the IMF did something similar, but they did it a lot better. I'd like to think because they had access to a better data set than was available in 1998, but there's probably some other reasons they did it better as well. And they actually found that higher levels of inequality were actually bad for economic growth. I think these cross-country regressions have a lot of challenges because everything causes everything else, so it's hard to do a clean natural experiment. You'd like to sort of infect some countries with inequality and leave some others without it and see what happens to them, and we can't do that. So I wouldn't want to do that, obviously. So I wouldn't take these cross-country regressions to the bank, but I would say they make it pretty hard to defend the proposition that inequality everywhere and always is good for growth and that there's definitely a trade-off. I think you can then look at the micro evidence and the channels by which different changes in inequality might affect growth. And I think there's a number of ones on the negative side of the ledger, inequality hurting growth. One is just the education that you want for economic growth to take as much talent from as broad a set of your population. And if one set of your population doesn't have access to a high quality preschool, they may never turn into what they could have turned into and contribute to the economy in the way they did. A second is risk-taking and entrepreneurial activity. Definitely requires you to be able to get some of the benefits of your activity, so get a high return from it. But it also requires a floor below which you won't fall. And so something like the Affordable Care Act, by saying no matter what risks you take in starting your own business, for example, you're not going to end up uninsured, can help you take those risks and can actually help your economic growth in that way. A third mechanism is trust. We can't, in a market economy, write down contracts that fully specify every aspect of an economic relationship and how much you're going to work, how many hours, how productive, how attentive you're going to be on the job. It requires a lot of trust. And inequality undermines trust, requires you to monitor people more, write more inefficient contracts where you have crop sharing type arrangements or just people that work less. The final one, which I don't think we've seen to date in the United States, but I think is a concern going forward, and I think it is something you've seen in other countries, like in Latin America, for example, is just the type of political instability that it introduces, the way in which it could undermine the support for the types of market institutions that foster economic growth. So I think those are four important ways in which, at a micro level, inequality can hurt us.
Okay. Well, what if it does hurt us? What if we see inequality and we want to do something about it, and the process does reduce the efficiency of the economy, i.e., it's a job killer? And I'm speaking here specifically, or perhaps not specifically, about the minimum wage. You want to talk a little bit about the minimum wage?
Sure. I mean, in my view, the evidence is that it has little or no effect on employment. I think there's a lot of research that documents that in terms of its reduction in turnover, its increase in the productivity of workers. So I wouldn't accept the premise that it's a trade-off. But I would note the Congressional Budget Office did an analysis of the minimum wage, has a number of issues that I'd argue with, but let's accept it for the sake of your discussion. They found 24 million people would get a raise, and they found that that was 50 times larger than the number that would be adversely affected in terms of their jobs. They also did the total dollars and found that the total dollar increase for those 24 million was much larger. I think it was $10 or $15 billion a year than any losses spread throughout the economy. So that on net, you were talking about something that over a decade would be equivalent of something like $150 billion tax cut. So I think even if you accepted the Congressional Budget Office's numbers, which as I said I don't, I think you'd still look at this and think, certainly many like Jared Bernstein have said, if these numbers are correct, I'd still take the deal.
Can you generalize on that at all? Essentially, I think what you're saying is, even if there is a trade-off, it becomes a cost-benefit problem.
Right.
How do you, that is, the benefits in terms of more equal distribution, the costs in terms of less efficiency and therefore slower growth. How do you make those trade-offs?
Right. I mean, economics doesn't give us an answer. To some degree, it depends on what your social welfare function is. But if something increases the growth rate for the bottom 90%, if it increases the growth rate for the median, if it increases the growth rate for the bottom 30%, I mean, I'm just throwing out some different concepts, not saying, this is the only one would use. I think all of those are a pretty reasonable way to judge an economic policy and to judge what the success of an economy is.
Well, you can't joke about it, but I can. So you're a job killer, basically.
But I don't, as I said before, I don't accept that premise, because I think if you look at a whole range of policies from preschool to the Affordable Care Act, I think they're helping jobs and helping the economy either in the short run, the long run, or some combination.
And for example, let's talk just a minute more about preschool. The idea is the rate of return on education, especially at the beginning, is very high.
Right.
And
a 5-year-old would have a hard time going to a bank and getting a loan against the increased earnings they're going to get.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going. That was exactly where I was going. It's essentially a capital market failure because the people can't borrow to invest heavily in themselves.
Right. I think that's the way. Yes.
That's the way economists like to think of it.
Exactly.
Nobody else does, right? Okay, fair enough.
And there's probably some external benefits there too, and there's also just even us as a society that people debate whether we should maximize for the 100%, the 90%, where it is. I think no one debates equality of opportunity. And so I think there's a values case for preschool that's grounded in equality of opportunity. But I think there's also a dollars and cents case in terms of a high return and a capital market failure that would lead that return to be underexploited.
I will end with this and open some questions, but there's one more elephant in the room in terms of efficiency, it seems to me, which could be exploited for making income more equal, which is climate change. That the market for energy is inefficient because there are externalities. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So that if you taxed emissions in some reasonable way and use the proceeds to redistribute income, you'd end up with both greater efficiency and an income distribution you preferred, at least some of us would prefer. Is that fair?
The president hasn't proposed that. But certainly when we think about our approach to climate, it very much is trying to do it in as economically efficient way as possible. The approach we've taken is going to give states a lot of choices in terms of how they do it. So one thing a state could do is, for example, set up a cap-and-trade system, auction off permits, and use some of that money to help low-income families or to help them with weatherization that will save their bills in the future. So I think you've seen a lot of different policy interventions in the climate space that have that type of win-win character.
Okay.
Certainly.
Well, by the way, this is just the highlights, or some of the highlights of the article. I urge you to read it. But what I want to do now with our remaining time, which is 10 or 15 minutes, is to open this up for some questions. Brad?
Jason, thoughtful as always. Perhaps we could go back to kind of the beginning slides, beginning of the discussion, and drill down a little bit more deeply on causes more so than consequences. You noted the charts that we've had flattening, maybe even shrinking productivity growth, and combined with demographic changes, maturing society, slow population growth, some increased savings as a result of having variable balance sheets, both corporate and household. Isn't it natural that you would have some flattening of wage growth? And if it is in part attributable to slower productivity growth, how do we address the issue of going back to previous levels of productivity growth?
Yeah, I think it's due to both. And, in fact, just to put magnitudes on it, and this isn't in the article, if we had continued at the productivity growth trend from 1948 to 1973, but had the same level of inequality increase that we saw, the typical family's income would have been about $35,000 higher this year than it was. And then to do the converse, if we had the slow productivity growth, but it had been shared equally instead of shared unequally, the typical household's income last year would have been about $10,000 higher. So of those two, that productivity is quantitatively larger. Now, there's an assumption embedded in that you could have higher productivity and the same inequality, but you might have had more inequality. So I think it gets a little more complicated. But I think the bigger lesson from what I said is both those numbers, $35,000 and $10,000, are quite large. Mm-hmm. And so both of those are important. If we have interventions that help both of them, that's our dream, and preschool is a great example of that. But certainly we should be investing in our infrastructure. We can pay for it by reforming our corporate tax system. We can invest more in technology. We can free up more spectrum for mobile broadband. All of these types of things, which are about growth and productivity, I do think have to be an important part of the answer to how we raise incomes.
But what in your view, if I do one follow-up, led to, or is the cause of the change in productivity growth up until, and then more recently, the flattening off?
Right. I think to some degree the 50s and 60s might have been a unique, unrepeatable event of a lot of pent-up innovation from World War II that was commercialized over the course of those decades. Some of it was that we invested at a scale that we should be repeating, but we're not, in things like the interstate highway system. And then the oil shocks, that sort of petered out, and the oil shocks came, which caused a lot of wrenching reallocation across our economy. And it took some time to get our feet back. We did somewhat get our feet back in the mid-1990s with the production of information technology, its use. We're now seeing energy and health, a lot of productivity improvements in those two sectors. So I think we do have, could have a potentially bright future in terms of our productivity growth. I'm not in the Robert Gordon, I'm not sort of dismal, depressed about the state of it. But I think it's an open question, and to some degree will depend on the types of choices that we make in public policy.
You mentioned that...
By the way, you should do tell us who you are.
Josh Gottbaum.
I was wondering, okay.
Late of Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, now as of yesterday as of Brookings. You mentioned that at the highest levels of income and wealth, the shift between labor income and capital was contributing recently. Given the fact that compensation for senior managements is capable of being flexible, i.e. characterized as capital gains or not, I just wondered if there's any evidence over the last couple of decades of a shift away from what we think of as normal labor income to capital income to take advantage of the tax arbitrage.
Right. You get a lot of tricky measurement issues, and some of the measures, like the Piketty-Saez data, are based on administrative tax data, and there is a concern that the observation distorts the way in which you're observing, distorts the thing that you're measuring. The income shift you also see in the National Income and Products Account data, which uses some of that administrative data, but I think is more immune to that problem. And that shift away from labor income, you only see starting around 2000 in this country. And you see it in a lot of countries around the world that don't have the same types of tax changes and necessarily recharacterization as we do. So I think it is a real thing that the pie is being divided up, sort of less for labor and more for capital. Although I think that's probably the third most important source of the increase in inequality, sort of smaller than the within labor and the within capital that we were talking about before.
Jason,
Who are you?
Exactly. I'm Deanna Farrell. Jason, I know your focus has been primarily on the income inequality side, but I wonder if you would elaborate a moment on the wealth side of this, which is even more extreme in many of the ways
Right.
you mentioned, and specifically on the range of policies that touch on it, whether it's the inheritance tax or housing policy, both mortgage interest rate deductions and all other Affordable Care Act, affordable housing issues, and just sort of touch on that, retirement accounts maybe, on that side of it as well, because I know you've thought
Yep.
a lot about that.
Yeah. So first of all, I think we shouldn't be shy about the high end. President fought really hard and got the estate tax rate up from, well, it was repealed briefly, but from 35 up to 40. That was a compromise. He would have liked to have gotten it higher, and in his budget he proposes to take it up to 45%. I talked about capital gains and dividend tax rates, which are an important part of the taxation of wealth, have gone from 15 to 23.8. But I think we shouldn't ignore the other side too, which is what you can do to expand wealth for the middle class. And one of the really, I think great proposals in the president's budget is one that was developed by Heritage and by Brookings, which you think means it would have become law 6 years ago, but that's not the way the world always works. And it would expand savings to everyone. Right now, about half of people have savings at their work. This would set up an IRA for everyone. It would make it automatic, so you could opt out if you didn't want to be a part of it. And I think that would really expand savings. I think there's probably other stuff that we could do. I think the disparity in the rate of return, it's not just some people have more wealth, but they tend to also have a higher rate of return on their wealth. Some of that, can't do something about. Some of that, looking at conflicts of interest or fiduciary rules for things like the IRA market, where a lot of people are paying very high fees and getting lower returns, might be is an area that we're taking a look at in terms of what we could do.
Any thoughts on housing?
Housing is an important part of that equation too, and what you want is home ownership, but you want it to be sustainable home ownership. You're not doing anyone a favor if you have some of the types of home ownership policies we had 10 or 20 years ago. So housing finance reform that provides access to mortgages for people, that includes a transparent funding source to help people that may not otherwise be able to afford housing, but that also puts the risk on private capital and makes that risk explicit, I think would be an important step we could take in housing, which is obviously the biggest source of wealth for the typical household.
Stacy.
Stacy Warden, and you know me because I introduced you 15 minutes ago. So, it's very interesting if you look at it as a global phenomenon that inequality has gone up in most every country, but global inequality has made tremendous progress over the last couple of decades. But the question of U.S. inequality bleeds into these globalization questions to a large degree. And, the argument runs that, well, there's this new global capital elite that is benefiting very much from globalization, but manufacturing is getting hit very hard by outsourcing to developing countries. And so how do you make a case or not for increased globalization, in particular in areas of trade and openness more generally? And how do you think that interplay actually works?
Right. So yeah, you're absolutely right that inequality has increased within the United States. Inequality has increased within China and India, but China and India have moved up. So even as the inequality increases, that goes up. And so if you measure, the human beings all over the world, inequality has gone down. And we're going to have globalization. It's not something we can stop. It's not something we should stop. There's enormous benefits, as you just described, that come from it. But we think if you do globalization in a better way, you can keep and possibly expand all of those benefits. So something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade agreement we're negotiating with our partners in the Pacific, which includes emerging economies in Latin America and emerging economies in the Pacific, we're putting strong labor and environmental standards in those. And we think that will help address inequality in the countries we're trading with, help address inequality in the United States, and help foster globalization. So I think the question is not whether we're globalizing. We're definitely globalizing. The question is how. And part of why we want agreements is so that we can define the way in which we're globalizing and channel it in a better direction than it might if it was left all to its own devices.
Let me push you on this issue. Perhaps the biggest beneficiaries of Walmart's pricing are the lower two-thirds of the income distribution. Is Walmart good or bad for income distribution in the United States?
This was a topic I had written on in my previous life, so people can just go find that. But should have sent it to you at the time. I think it's unpublished, but it's on the internet. You know, I think capitalism, a market economy, has delivered a lot of benefits for a lot of people, but it hasn't shared those benefits in the way that we'd like, and that's a particular problem when it's not a matter of everyone's growing, but some people are growing more, but when a big group in the middle is flat. And I think that raises a much greater concern. I think you need to look at the whole set of issues around that.
Well, it's clear you still have a job. Just a few more questions, please.
Hi, Greg Simon. Hi, Jason.
Hey.
Since 1974, when the SEC instituted the accredited investor rules, and the banks had enough computing power to do mass consumer credit cards, the people who were allowed to invest in the private economy have acquired enormous amounts of wealth, and everybody else acquired an enormous amount of debt to buy the same things: better house, better car, better school. But some people were allowed to invest in small businesses that were just starting and others were not. Now, 40 years later, how can we have inequality solutions if we continue excluding most of the people in the country from investing in small businesses and private companies, while the government is perfectly willing to let them gamble and buy all the lottery tickets they want to give government tax revenue, when the private sector is responsible for nearly all of the job creation? The small businesses are responsible for nearly all the job creation, and yet we only allow 9 million people to invest in private companies. Don't you think those rules have to go away so we can open up the private economy to the kind of investment that we need in the public sector as well?
Mm-hmm. So I haven't personally fully looked at and thought through all of those rules, and the force of your question will encourage me to do so. Certainly in the Jobs Act that the president did on a bipartisan basis and signed into law a few years ago, was trying to expand the opportunity of who could invest, and as well as expand companies in terms of the capital that they could get. And the SEC and others have been working to implement those. And I think those were a good idea, and I think those will help. You obviously have to balance all of that against making sure we still have the type of investor protections that we think are important too. And that legislation tried to strike that balance in terms of giving people that opportunity to invest and making sure that they weren't sort of in the wild, wild west in terms of where they were. But I'll think harder about it.
I think two more questions, and I think that'll be it, okay, guys, because Jason has to go home.
I wish.
Why did you collect them together?
So my name is Matt Stoller. I work for Congressman Alan Grayson. Apologize for Congress, actually the whole thing. The question I have is sort of an accounting question relating to the Gini coefficient that you talked about, the rollback of inequality under the Obama administration. So if you rolled back, you asserted that there's been about a decade-long rollback of inequality. How does that square with the data from Piketty and Saez, which I assume says something slightly different, but says that in the recovery, income, the growth has gone not just overwhelmingly to the top 1%, but something like 120, 125% of the growth has gone to the top 1%'s income, which means to say that everyone else's income is going down.
Right.
So what am I getting wrong in terms of reconciling your...
Why don't I just answer that quickly and then we can do the other one. Two things. Their data is pre-tax. So their data does not reflect precisely the things I was talking about. It doesn't incorporate those tax cuts for the families with children. It doesn't incorporate the higher tax rates on high-income households. So I was looking after tax. They're looking before tax. There's no doubt before tax income inequality has continued to rise, and that's a phenomenon that was building up for decades and would take a while to change. That's number one. Then number two, this is a smaller issue, but I was doing a counterfactual of what inequality would have been as compared to what it is. It's that much lower. Not saying that's the direct change, but the most important thing is, yeah, we have tools that affect the distribution of income, pre-tax, like the minimum wage, and post-tax, like taxes on high-income households.
Okay, I think the last question.
Thank you. Valérie Rouxel from the EU delegation. I just wondered if you could comment, what were your thoughts on the decline in labor force participation in the US, and what is your view on how it's affecting potential growth? And more specifically, has this decline, according to your studies, has this decline mostly affected certain parts of the income distribution, and disproportionately, the higher brackets versus the lower brackets? How does this play out in your argument?
Right. So the Council of Economic Advisors did a really extensive study on labor force participation. You could read that, or there's a shorter version we published in a website called Vox EU, which mostly publishes things about Europe, but we were willing to contribute. There's not great data on labor force participation by income, so we were more looking at age, demographic groups, those types of breakdowns. And the short answer is about half of what we've seen is because of the aging of the population. About a sixth of what we're seeing is just a normal business cycle. Unemployment rate goes up, participation goes down. And then you'll see the opposite. As unemployment goes down, participation will go up. And then some of it is some longer-term structural trends that have been adverse in our economy, and some of it is just this business cycle was much worse than previous ones in terms of long-term, this recession. In terms of long-term unemployment and in terms of participation. And a lot of that you've seen in young people. A lot of those young people have stayed longer in school, so the net effect of that remains to be seen, and there's some things on the plus side of the ledger in addition to the things on the minus side of the ledger. I think the economic recovery is going to help, but I think to have more inclusive growth, we need to bring more people back into the workforce. So policies like paid leave and more workplace flexibility, for example, could help bring more women in. Policies like expanding the earned income tax credit for parents without children and non-custodial parents could take young men, disproportionately young men of color, and help bring them back into the workforce. So I think there's a longer-term set of structural challenges we as a country face here.